This occurred about 3 years ago. As I was driving from my parents' house to the college at night on a road I knew very well, I spotted someone walking in the same direction. As he heard my car approaching, he turned around and raised his thumb, signaling that he needed a ride. With a long road ahead of me, and noticing that he was an old man, I decided to let him in. He hopped inside my car, and we started talking. A few miles later, I noticed the man getting agitated. He was twitching inside the car and wasn't saying a word. He clenched his fist around his chest, indicating that something was wrong. "Are you okay?" I inquired. The man replied, "I just have this intense sudden pain in my chest," and I immediately realized he might be having a heart attack. He urgently proposed, "Can you take me to the general hospital? Take the second exit to the right. It's down the road." That's exactly what I did. I followed the man's instructions, speeding in my car and taking the second exit to the right. I found myself on a narrow road, barely lit at all. For a moment, I thought we might have taken the wrong turn, but the man confirmed it was the right way and that the hospital was farther down the road. As I kept going, I was suddenly surprised by a barricaded road with spikes ahead. I didn't understand what was happening. Just as I was turning to the man to ask him about this, he opened the door and left the car. Perplexed by his reaction, I shifted my gaze, analyzing the surroundings. Emerging from the bushes that surrounded the tiny road, I noticed a group of men charging towards me. These people were carrying pistols and pump shotguns. They screamed at me to get out of my vehicle, but I hit reverse and accelerated back on the same road I came through. As I was leaving, I suddenly started hearing gunshots. Most of their shots totally missed, but I felt some pierce through the metallic body of my vehicle. I immediately dialed the cops and told them everything that had happened while driving. Once I found myself in a safe zone, in a pretty crowded city, I stopped assessing the damages. One of the bullets was actually so close to my car's gas tank that if it had hit, I would have been blown to pieces by now. When the cops arrived at the area, there was no one. The guys who did that to me were nowhere to be found, and no one had been charged nor arrested. As a truck driver with over 1 million miles traveled, I thought I had seen it all on the roads, but I realized I was completely mistaken. I clocked in for a delivery from Nashville to Chicago around 8 p.m. The trip typically takes 7 hours, so I immediately hit the road. Not being familiar with the area as it was my first time on this route, I relied on my GPS. A few hours of monotonous driving passed, and it was already midnight. While we usually have the options to stay in a motel or sleep in our trucks, I didn't feel like it that night. I still had energy and wanted to deliver the truck as soon as possible. Soon, I found myself driving almost alone on a very empty road. The lighting was subpar, with poles spaced far apart, some of them not even lit. This prompted me to reduce my speed and be more cautious. Driving along, I noticed something a few feet away from me under one of the poorly lit poles. Slowing down to investigate, I discovered a young man hitchhiking. Although I hesitated for a moment, I decided to pick him up. I stopped beside him, rolled down the window, and he asked, "Are you going to Chicago?" I nodded, and he thanked me before hopping inside. We exchanged pleasantries, and I learned his name was Michael. He had missed his last bus due to working late. Initially, he seemed cool, and I enjoyed our conversation. However, things quickly took a strange turn. Just 1 mile after picking him up, I noticed another hitchhiker under a pole who looked remarkably like Michael. I brushed it off as imagination. A few miles later, a third encounter shook me. This hitchhiker was undeniably Michael, dressed the same and looking absolutely identical. I looked from the window to Michael, confusion written all over my face. "Who is that person right there?" Michael quickly looked through the window and back at me. "I'm not seeing anyone," he replied. And to my horror, when Michael looked back at me, his face was completely transformed into that of an elderly man. My blood ran cold, and I felt a cold sweat on my neck. "Are you okay?" Michael asked. I said yes, trying to push aside the bizarre events. Desperate to change the subject, I asked, "Want to listen to some radio, Michael?" His response chilled me to the bone. "I'd love to, but you got my name wrong. I'm Jordan. You seem really tired." He laughed as he replied. Terrified, I felt trapped in an eternal hallucination, questioning my own sanity as thoughts raced in my head. However, I just decided to keep driving, praying to see the city soon enough and get out of this very lonely road. The guy beside me, whoever that was, remained silent for the rest of the trip, his eyes locked on me, making me feel uneasy. But suddenly, his voice broke the silence, and his words shook my core. "You have a beautiful face. Mind if I borrow it?" His words nearly stopped my heart. I turned toward him and saw his face shift into mine. It felt like I was staring into a mirror, but it quickly transformed into a demonic entity, seeing my face turn into a greenish color as if it was rotting. His laughter echoed in my truck, and that was the breaking point. I slammed the brakes, jumped out of the vehicle, and ran to the side of the road, making sure whatever it was didn't follow me. I called 911, and they arrived 20 minutes later. They found nothing in the truck, and my story wasn't convincing, leading to drug tests. But to this day, I'm sure everything happened. I wasn't imagining anything at all. As a child, I never thought my family's financial struggles could potentially put my life at risk. Nevertheless, this realization early in life opened my eyes to the concept of privilege. Growing up with my single mother in a fairly impoverished neighborhood, even pursuing an education posed as a challenge. The school lay about 4 miles away from home, with no scholar transport available. Consequently, we had to endure the daily trek, covering the distance to and from school. It was an utterly draining process, both in terms of time and energy. However, I wasn't alone in this struggle. A lot of my friends shared a similar plight. We walked together, engaging in various activities, playing hide and seek, occasional scuffles, and even sneaking candy from a nearby store. Returning home, we were consistently exhausted, having spent 6 hours at school. Desiring a solution to our weariness, we began hitchhiking on our way back. Most of the time, kind-hearted individuals would stop and offer us rides, easing the journey home. However, one particular encounter completely shifted my perspective on this practice. Standing in our usual spot, a few feet away from our school's main gate, hitchhiking, an elderly man in a weathered mini-truck halted for us. He inquired about our destination, gesturing for us to hop inside. As we settled in, he asked for our names and the reason we weren't with our parents. Upon explaining our situation, he fell into a contemplative silence. While driving, he abruptly received a phone call. Although I couldn't hear the other party's words, I deduced from his responses. "What, the road to Twaneftor is closed?" Twaneftor being my hometown. I realized it was probably due to inclement weather, a common occurrence to which we were used to, so I didn't dwell on it too much. "The road to your houses is blocked, but don't worry, I know a little secret way no one knows, and you'll be there faster," he chuckled. As awkward as his statement sounded, we smiled and thanked him. Minutes turned into hours as he continued driving, and darkness began to envelop the surroundings. That's when I sensed something was off. "Mister, how much farther until we reach our houses?" I questioned. "You're almost there, son," the old man uttered as he continued driving. However, the surroundings he led us to bore no resemblance to our familiar neighborhood. Instead, we found ourselves traversing a rural route, with trees lining both sides of the road, prompting me to question whether the old man was diverting us from our intended destination. I turned to my friends, whispering, "Where is he taking us?" As I shifted my gaze forward, I noticed him peering at us through the rearview mirror. "What's that little conversation you guys are having?" he queried, abruptly slamming the brakes. Recognizing this as the opportune moment to escape, I reached for the door handle, attempting to open it unnoticed. However, the vehicle emitted a beep, and before I knew it, he accelerated, speeding away. Contemplating jumping out of the fast-moving vehicle, I hesitated, realizing it could lead to a fatal outcome. As he continued speeding, we screamed, but he relentlessly repeated, "You'll be there soon. You'll be there soon." Terrified, we banged on the windows, crying and screaming at the top of our lungs, desperate to find a way out, as we became increasingly convinced the man had malicious intentions. "You can scream and cry as much as you want. No one will hear you here," he callously declared. His words shook me to the core, triggering my survival instinct. The three of us began hitting the man, and I even resorted to using my pens to stab him in the head. While not a substantial effort, it inflicted enough pain for him to lose control of the car, colliding with a nearby tree. Miraculously, all three of us emerged unscathed from the accident, but the man remained trapped inside his immobilized mini-truck. For the ensuing hours, we ran together, screaming for help, desperately hoping someone would find us. Fortunately, our plea was answered when a young man discovered us. We recounted our story, and he promptly called the police, offering us refuge in his home. Providing food and shelter, he reassured us that everything would be fine. Within minutes, the police arrived at the man's residence. After our interrogation, we were finally reunited with our families, who had been frantically searching for us. An investigation commenced, revealing the man's mini-truck abandoned with no trace of him. Subsequently, we identified him through photographs that the police showed us. The elderly man was then revealed to be Jeremiah Naga, the prime suspect in a series of kidnapping and murder cases around the area. Now, 40 years later, my body breaks into a cold sweat every time I remember I was confined inside the vehicle of a deranged killer.